My name is Jana McElroy, and I'm on the Art Committee, and I'd like to welcome you all to our first art program of the year at the 19th Century Club, where our vision is to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. I'm so pleased to introduce Sarah Kelly Oehler. She is the Field McCormick Chair and Curator of the Art of Americas at the Art Institute of Chicago. She received her BA in History from Yale University and her PhD in American Art from Columbia. In 2018, she curated the critically acclaimed Charles White retrospective, which was the first major retrospective of the influential African-American artists in several decades. And then in 2024, she organized the Georgia O'Keeffe exhibition called My New Yorks, which explored the artist's urban subjects in the broader context of her work in the 1920s. She has also contributed to many exhibitions and publications in the over 20 years that she has been on the staff at the Art Institute of Chicago. So let's welcome Sarah Kelly Oehler.
Thank you, Jana. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for this lecture about Elizabeth Catlett. And I really plan to explore her intertwined art and politics. And what I hope you'll see is that Catlett was a talented and multifaceted artist. She was an ardent feminist, and she was a lifelong social activist. She really dedicated her life to portraying Black and Mexican women, subjects that she rarely saw in the fine arts during her lifetime. And she was constantly striving to uplift their dignity, their power, their beauty, their humanity. She fervently believed that her people, and in fact what she would call her two peoples, Black and Mexican women, deserved equality with other Americans, and she used her art to champion causes that were near and dear to her heart and to argue for social change. So I was invited to give this lecture in conjunction with our current exhibition, Elizabeth Catlett, a Black revolutionary artist and all that it implies. And this is a show that was organized by the Brooklyn Museum and the National Gallery in collaboration with the Art Institute, and I was honored to write for the catalog and serve as the curator at the Art Institute. And so I really hope you all either have had a chance to see the show or plan on getting down to the Art Institute. It's there until January 4th, which feels maybe like a long way away, but it will go quickly. It's the holidays. So this exhibition is really the first to explore her career holistically and showcase all aspects of her artistic production, which includes, and what is not known to many people, it includes paintings, prints, and sculptures. So there's in fact been any number of exhibitions of her prints. I would say that's what is most widely known. But rarely have there been any shows that have brought together all of these different media. And so we're really trying to showcase that in a show that has somewhat of a chronological bent, but also displays her art in interrelated thematic groups. And this is really intended, again, to showcase her dual commitment to artistic excellence on the one hand and social justice on the other, and how they come together. So I want to start with a story that I think is very indicative of much about Elizabeth Catlett that you should know. And so that is that in May 1970, Catlett was living in Mexico. She had been living there since 1946, and she applied for a visa to visit the United States. And her purpose was to speak at a conference, in fact, at Northwestern University, the Conference on the Functional Aspects of Black Art. Now, you might be wondering why Catlett, who after all was an American citizen born in Washington, D.C., needed a visa to return from Mexico to the United States. But the reality was that 8 years prior, the Mexican government had granted her dual citizenship, and the United States government responded by immediately revoking her U.S. citizenship. They declared her an undesirable alien, and that was entirely due to her willingness to express her leftist politics through art and activism. And so in 1970, not for the first time, her visa application was denied. Now, despite this setback, Catlett remained undaunted. She gave her speech by telephone. Imagine this. This is 1970. And she called from Mexico to Northwestern so that she could give her speech. And she spoke about this visa denial. She said, "I was refused on the grounds that, as a foreigner, there was a possibility I would interfere in social or political problems, and thus I constituted a threat to the well-being of the United States of America. To the degree and in the proportion that the United States constitute a threat to Black people, to that degree and more do I hope I have earned that honor. For I have been and am currently and always hope to be a Black revolutionary artist and all that it implies," hence the subtitle. It's certainly powerful words, and I think speaks volumes about her determination, about her philosophy of how art and activism can work together, and how she put herself into the struggle. So as a Black woman living in Mexico, she saw, and certainly as a woman who grew up in the United States, she saw and experienced how social and racial injustice held back her people. And so she committed herself to that fight, to fight those powerful entrenched forces. As she said, she wanted to be a Black revolutionary artist, and we see that expressed powerfully in works such as these two, which is Target Practice, the sculpture on the left, and Harriet Tubman on the right. But she also added on this tale, all that it implies, which is really a sort of wonderfully larger self-definition that I think encourages us to think about what it actually means for her to declare herself to be a revolutionary artist. Because I would argue you could start with her subject matter. In many of her works, she is not looking at what might be considered revolutionary. She's focusing on working class Black and Mexican women doing everyday things. They're cooking meals, or they're simply sitting and feeling worn out, as you see in these two works. So this is not, I think, to our eyes today, works that you might call revolutionary. They don't seem particularly radical, but in fact, throughout Catlett's life, her choice to focus on women of color was a very revolutionary act. It was very radical. These were not subjects that were being depicted in the fine arts, and certainly not positively when they were. And so simply put, creating authentic depictions of women of color was a bold political and social stance. But Catlett's revolutionary ethos didn't stop with her subject matter. A crucial part of the narrative of the show at the Art Institute is to focus on how her artistic practice really was sort of bolstered everything she did in her activism. She considered it her obligation as a Black artist to excel artistically by mastering her craft specifically. She stated at one point, quote, "Technique is so important. It's the difference between art and ineptitude. Because our audiences deserve the best, we must equip ourselves to give them the very best." And so for Catlett, this basically caused her to consistently seek and evolve with the times. She explored, for example, what she considered to be her ancestral legacies of traditional African art, but as well of pre-Columbian sculpture, which she saw in Mexico. And you see that really in the head on the left, which is from the DuSable Museum here in Chicago. But she also kept her style really fresh. So for example, she started incorporating ideas from international pop art into her work. And you see that in Angela Libre, which is the print on the right. There's a really bold use of color and repetition that you see in this work that suggests how she's experimenting with materials. She also printed this on silver foil. And so she's innovating and evolving throughout her career, and that is part of her activism as well. She didn't rest on her laurels. Now, Catlett was keenly aware of how her preferred media could convey different ideas, and specifically contrasted the possibilities of printmaking versus sculpture, both, methodologies she's very familiar with. But she was thinking, as she said, "I'm thinking differently in the two mediums. In the printmaking, I'm thinking about something social or political, and in the sculpture, I'm thinking about form." So she's recognizing that her prints and her sculptures function differently because her prints could carry a very direct or pointed meaning, but she wanted her sculptures to be more universal, more sumptuous often, and be more about the sort of qualities, the tactile qualities of the sculpture. And I think you really see that in these two works. Both of them are fundamentally about the idea of beauty for Black women. The print contains these multiple repetitions of the slogan, "Black is beautiful," which I'm sure you can't see on the screen, but they're there. And then the sculpture has this incredible inherent beauty of the stone, and then the way that she has actually aligned or sort of chosen to carve the sculpture so that the veining of this yellow onyx is incredibly vertical. It sort of really gives a regality to the figure, this very luscious yellow butterscotchy onyx. So I'm really delighted that we've had a chance at the Art Institute to celebrate her exceptional art and spirit here in Chicago. And I will say, I think I'm completely biased, but there's no better location for this exhibition because, in fact, Catlett spent a very formative period of her life in Chicago. And I'll discuss that in a few minutes, but it's felt really wonderful to bring her art back to Chicago. And so for the rest of our time together, I'm going to essentially interweave her biography, her art, and the ideas and the themes of the show. So hopefully you get a sense of it should you in fact go down to the museum. All right, so Catlett was born in 1915, as I mentioned, in Washington, D.C. And her parents were the children of enslaved people, but they worked in education, both of them, and they early on impressed upon her the importance of education. And that is something that she carried with her for her entire life, as I'll discuss later on. Now, in 1931, Catlett enrolled at Howard University, also in Washington. Now, this wasn't actually her first choice. She had really wanted to go to Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh, but she was denied entrance once they discovered she was Black. That said, her choice to go to Howard probably was extremely beneficial. Howard, by this point, had established itself as one of the leading educational institutions for Black students, and it had a tremendous art department. So this is a photograph of her with her mentor, Lois Mallow Jones, who was a major artist of the moment. And so at Howard, Catlett really receives a top-notch education in drawing and design. That's her declared major. So she's studying with Jones, she's studying with James Porter, some of the luminaries of the Harlem Renaissance are at Howard. And as well, Howard's art gallery, most people don't think about that, but the gallery itself also brought in exhibitions that were extremely important for Catlett to see. And this was not an opportunity that she actually otherwise had access to in the city, the segregated city of DC. As Catlett said, quote, "Washington was Jim Crow then, and we didn't have a chance to go to many things." So Howard gave her that opportunity. Now, after graduating from Howard, she began the first of many teaching positions. Catlett was an educator throughout her entire life. But she realized she didn't feel like she was being paid enough, and so she went back to school for an advanced degree. And she actually ends up enrolling at the University of Iowa. And she starts there in 1938, and soon earns the first Master of Fine Arts degree ever granted to a Black woman. Now, fascinatingly for us in Chicago, her teacher at Iowa was Grant Wood, who, of course, had made himself famous for American Gothic. And so Wood encouraged her in a number of ways that were extremely important. So first of all, she went to Iowa to study painting. Wood is a painter. She wants to be a painter. But he actually encouraged her to take up sculpture. He thought that she had a facility for it, and so indeed she does. He also suggested, and this is something he was already doing, that she focus on subjects that were of relevance to her and her community. So it didn't matter what he was doing. He wanted her to focus on what she thought she should be doing. And then as well, he pushed her to a sort of subtle stylization of form. She had had this great academic background, but she was not terribly abstracted in in her style, and so that's something she would embrace more fully and would become very important to her. So indeed, her thesis for Iowa is this sculpture here, which is now lost, which she called Negro Mother and Child. So it's certainly suggesting she took Wood's advice to heart. It's her first attempt to represent motherhood in sculpture, and this would become one of her most enduring subjects. But she said in the statement that she had to write, she said, "The implications of motherhood, especially Negro motherhood, are quite important to me, as I am a Negro as well as a woman." So again, she has taken up what Wood has suggested. Now, later that same year, she is starting her intersections with Chicago. She's actually already visited Chicago. It was an important visit that I talk about in my essay, should you want to buy the catalog. But she exhibited the sculpture, her thesis sculpture, at the monumental American Negro Exposition in Chicago. And this was a massive show. It opened on July 4th, 1940, in celebration of the 75th anniversary of the abolition of slavery. Now, her carving won the first place prize in sculpture. Not bad for a brand new sculptor. And she really actually beat out a number of more established artists. And this show really brought her much sort of greater national visibility. The jury was a national jury, so she's suddenly sort of working on a national stage. So in the summer of 1941, she's graduated from Iowa. She takes a job at Dillard University as the chair of the art department at Dillard in New Orleans. And then in the summer of 41, she decides she wants to come to Chicago, where she had already, as I said, sort of started to make ties. And so she rooms with her closest friend in the city, who is Margaret Taylor Goss Burroughs, which might be a familiar name to some of you around the city. She founded the DuSable Art Museum, and she was very instrumental in the then brand new Southside Community Arts Center, which is of course still operating on the South Side. And so Catlett quickly became a member of the vibrant community of artists on the South Side, which included Burroughs. It also included Charles White, the artist I did a show on several years ago. She would marry Charles White in December of 1941. And so Catlett, during her time in Chicago, worked at the Southside Community Arts Center. She was studying lithography maybe a little bit. It's a little unclear. And then also ceramics at the School of the Art Institute. So she's also spending time at the Art Institute. Now, unfortunately for me, no works can be conclusively proven to be from her Chicago period. I cannot tell you how much I looked for that. But she recalled that it was a very productive time. She said, quote, "It was a very fulfilling summer. I felt like I was progressing." And so she indeed sort of kept going, working on sculpture, and she recalled that she worked on a stone carving of a head of a man. And so it's very possible that this sculpture, which is now in the Art Institute's collection, was the work, because there aren't actually that many extant sculptures of men from Catlett. And stylistically, this is exactly aligned with what she is doing in her work at this moment. And we have some sort of, I would say, documentary evidence of that. But you can see this is a sculpture, there's a bit of stylization, the forms are sort of defined, but there's not a lot of abstraction, because that's exactly where she's going. So this is, abstraction's really an aesthetic she would brace within just a year or two. So in January of 1942, Catlett and her brand new husband, White, moved to New York City. And so that really, again, her Chicago period is short, but it is quite important for her. And she began studying with a Russian-born sculptor named Osip Zadkine. And he really encouraged her to push further on abstraction, and specifically by looking at African art. Catlett said later, quote, "It had never occurred to me that the study of African art could be a way of learning about abstract form." And so she moves from the gentle stylization that White had somewhat encouraged into a much greater sense of abstraction. And I think you can really see that in the terracotta head that's here, which dates from 1944 and is no longer extant that we know of. So again, if you see these things, let me know. But she's really sort of thinking differently about form and how she makes it. Now, in New York, Catlett quickly becomes integral to the city's Black artistic community. So it's actually very parallel to the leftist community she had found in Chicago. She finds a similar community in New York City. And she begins teaching, continuing her teaching career, she begins teaching at the George Washington Carver School in Harlem. And this is very much like the Southside Community Arts Center. It's a school that was intended to bring education to working class people in their own neighborhood. And so Catlett was their fundraiser, their promotion director, and she also taught sculpture and dressmaking. And in fact, the top listing on the right there is her class, How to Make a Dress. So she is teaching that. But it's interesting because the Carver School is Marxist-oriented, and so part of their education is a political education. And so even the most innocuous of topics could become fodder for political discussion. Catlett recalled people asking, well, how do you teach Marxism making a dress? And then she added on, I said, well, while we're sewing, we talk, you know. So she's really seizing opportunities to educate students about practical things, about art, but also about politics and many other ideas. Now, in turn, she was very inspired to depict the woman she met at the Carver School. And this is one of those paintings, this portrait of a woman in a green hat. She recalled, quote, suddenly I want to draw these people, these women who were to me so strong and so wonderful, and from whom I was learning a lot. And I love in this work, like Catlett has so beautifully captured this woman's very skeptical expression here. I think really sort of conveying this moment for this in this woman's life. But Catlett's time in New York City coincided with the entry of the United States into World War II. And like many Black artists, Catlett was keenly aware of how Black Americans were being asked to play integral roles in the fight for freedom. You know, they were serving in the military, they were serving as nurses, as you see here, but they were then being subject to segregation and racial discrimination at home. And so she deliberately set out to create works that would call attention to the sacrifice and the dedication of workers, as in the Army nurse. And here, again, I think this is probably a model for a larger project. But she's really accentuated the shadows around the figure's eyes. She's calling attention to this woman's determination, but she's also calling attention to the weariness and the hardship of her life. Black women, certainly as nurses, were facing significant racial discrimination throughout World War II. And so Catlett's really endowing the subject with more heroic notes, I think, to counteract those ideas. Now, Catlett's newfound interest in abstraction absolutely starts appearing in her paintings as well. I'm showing you here War Worker, and here you can see how she's emphasizing the very angular nature of his facial features with these sort of sharp lines of the nose and sweeping brushwork that creates a really dynamic rhythm throughout this work. Again, I think intentionally heightening the focus on his downcast eyes and creating this very expressive and empathetic composition. But in 1945, and this is sort of all intertwined, she wins a fellowship. It's the prestigious Julius Rosenwald Fellowship. Rosenwald was a Chicagoan. He was president of Sears Roebuck, and he created an important fellowship opportunity for Black artists. And this supported her work for 2 years. And she based her application on this ability that she was already demonstrating to depict Black women with authenticity. And in particular, she argued that she would create a series about the lives of Black women. She originally called this the Negro Woman series, and then in 1989, she renamed it the Black Woman series. So you'll see both get referred to. And the first work is the one I'm showing you here, in which we see this close focus on a woman's face looking off to the left. And then each title of the 15 prints, and these are now line-cut prints, each work has a title that together read as a poem about women's lives and the forces of racism and gender discrimination and class discrimination that have shaped their lives. So it starts out, I am the Negro woman. I have always worked hard in America, in the fields, in other folks' homes. And in fact, I'll show you some of those works. So she starts on this journey, which can be sort of loosely broken apart into 3 sections. So the first section is really focusing on the labor of Black women, the I have worked hard in America part of this series. But she then turns, so she talks about how they've worked hard. She then turns to the specific contributions of women throughout history. So in particular, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman again, and Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first African-American woman poet. But I should say she also celebrates contributions by unnamed Black women. So she's sort of getting at both the famous and the unknown, but the way they have made contributions. But the series then takes a turn. Catlett declares, my reward has been bars between me and the land, or the rest of the land. And she goes on to detail in the next section what those rewards were. So for example, I have special reservations. That's a reference to segregation in public spaces. She says, for example, I have special houses, which is about segregated houses. And then the final reward is probably the most poignant of all. She says, I have a special fear for my loved ones. And it's so clearly invoking the history of lynching in the United States. It's a series that closes then with this work, where she declares very forcefully, my right is a future of equality with other Americans. And now we see the face, now turned to the right, offering a clarion call, a call to action. So it takes you, this series takes you on this incredible emotional journey through labor, through contributions, through prejudice, to end with what people should do and what they should look for. It's really a series that is key to understanding so much of her work after this fact. She's got this sharp focus on Black female subjectivity. She prioritizes the narrative power of the works, and then she executed each one of them in line of cut with an astute sense of compositional clarity so that you can tell what is happening no matter where you are in the series. And perhaps most importantly, it really shows how for Catlett, the personal was political. These were intertwined elements that could not be separated in her life or in her art. Now, Catlett created the Black Woman series while living in Mexico. She moved there in 1946. She was trying to teach in New York, work on this series, couldn't get enough done, decides to go to Mexico, and has the money from the Rosenwald Fellowship. So Charles White goes with her. They almost immediately return to divorce very quickly. So that's the end of Charles White and her life. And in 1947, she marries the artist Francisco Mora, who you see here on the left. He is someone that she would develop an incredibly rich and supportive artistic life with. They were married until his death many decades later. They had 3 sons, who you see here in a print that she called Mis Niños. And so this, I think, was sort of really important to her to have this stability in her life. Now, upon arriving in Mexico City in 1946, she began working with a group called the Taller de Gráfico Popular, or the People's Graphic Workshop, or the TGP. Now, the TGP was primarily a printmaking collective dedicated to producing inexpensive prints that could circulate widely and carry strong political or social messages. They predominantly used line-a-cut, which enabled them to do that, but not exclusively. And most importantly, this was, as with Chicago, as with New York, another community of like-minded artists for Catlett to become involved with. And she, in fact, became the only American-born permanent members of the TGP. There was a lot of American guest artists that would go down to Mexico and stay for a while, but she stays for decades. And so this is when she really embraces what she began seeing as her two peoples, Black Americans and Mexicans, and creating prints, even though she's in Mexico, that respond to what's happening both in the US and in Mexico. Now, one of her most important subjects from her time with the TGP is the motif of the sharecropper. And this was a theme that she investigated actually in several ways, starting in the mid-1940s. So she initially actually creates an image of the black sharecropper, which you see on the left there. And it's a pretty small print of this, a male sharecropper on the left. But she also started exploring it in oil painting as well. So this is all right around 1945, 46. But she then, in 1952, worked the composition up into an extraordinary piece, one that she printed millions of times, exaggerating, many times over and over again, in black and white, sometimes in color. These were not prints that were necessarily meant to be precious. They were meant to be out in the world. But they are extraordinary prints. So I'm showing you a color version that's actually in the Art Institute's collection. And you can really see her sure hand at work. She has really mastered linocut, and you see this in the sort of incredible mastery of the shading, all the different directions of the shading to create different tones, different effects, different forms. We see her angular figural style, and especially this sense of this uplifted face of the dignity and the self-possession of this woman. Now, members of the TGP worked frequently in a collaborative manner. They wanted to create works that sort of modeled their collaboration as a printmaking collective. So they're thinking together about history and social justice and equal rights, both of which, again, were quite important in the United States and in Mexico. And so Catlett actually designed and led one fascinating project. It was an entire portfolio, dozens of prints, called Against Discrimination in the United States. And in each print, and we have a small group at the Art Institute now, was created by a different artist of the TGP, all about Black history. So Tubman chose Harriet Tubman again, Catlett chose Harriet Tubman again, as sort of her preferred historical figure. And again, a figure that she wants to uplift as much as possible to sort of counteract the lack of visibility that Harriet Tubman had in the telling of history and in the fine arts. But other artists were choosing politicians or thinkers, and for example, someone like Nat Turner, who was who had led a slave insurrection in the 1830s. And this was by Alberto Beltran, another member of the Mexican TGP. And so it's a sort of fascinating series that really explores Black history through the lens of Mexican artists. Now, one of my favorite prints in the show is this work here, which is a monumental print. It's actually been newly conserved. This is also in the Art Institute's collection. And Catlett designed the image here, but Alberto Beltran did the carving of the linocut. These are two massive sheets of linoleum that they would have had to carve. And this was a work done to support the first National Peace Congress, which was a meeting to promote peace and prevent war that was held in Mexico City in 1951. And so we see here this giant protective hand shielding the group of workers and peasants. And of course, most prominent amongst them below the hand is this mother and child who has this powerful pose that's both protective but also quite defiant. The expression on her face is very much one of defiance that I think speaks to Catlett's own ethos. But Catlett's activism on behalf of the peace movement thrust her into Cold War politics. The TGP, along with many other activist groups on the left, argued that the United States, which of course was the sole nation at that time with nuclear power, would have disproportionate ability to curtail global freedom movements. So this is the moment where the US government begins surveilling Catlett along with other members of the TGP. And this is what ultimately led to her citizenship being revoked in 1962. And I should add, she did not get her citizenship back until 2002, some 40 years after it was revoked. So, nevertheless, or precisely because she was a political exile, I think she had a certain degree of freedom where she could just continue to align herself actively with Pan-American struggles for peace and freedom. She was so keenly aware, certainly, of what was still happening in the United States. She's very much keeping, up to date on the civil rights movement, on the emergence of Black power, and many other aspects of Black culture in the U.S. And so she's creating works in support of that. And that includes this sculpture, which is a double-sided sculpture called Black Unity. So it actually is the fist on one side and the two faces on the other. And it's clearly in support of the Black Power movement. Now, this was 1968. So, of course, what do we think about but something, like, for example, the raised fist at the Mexico City Olympics that same year. And this is then a motif that Catlett reprises again in a sculpture she calls Homage to My Young Black Sisters. So this is clearly her work on behalf of the Black Power movement that's very important and would have been seen sort of directly in that arena. But she, like I said, wanted her sculptures to be a bit more universal. Like, they could still start in something political, but have a universal form to them. And so I'm showing you here Political Prisoner from 1971. And this is actually inspired by photographs of the activist Angela Davis being arrested in 1970. But she actually moved quite deliberately away from, I would say, markers of it being Angela Davis. Angela Davis very famously had an afro. She sort of toned that down so that she could remove the direct references to Angela Davis and thus open up that this could be a more universal idea. And she said at this time that this was, quote, not just Angela Davis, but all the political prisoners, and we have a lot of them in Mexico too. So she's thinking about Mexican political prisoners alongside of this. But her printmaking remained very direct, very pointed, and very powerful. And she would cross national boundaries to address the politics of Central and South America. She's actually, after all, located in Mexico, so she's sort of well positioned to do this. So there's a series that I'm fascinated by that starts with a print that's on the left there called Alta la Agresión, or Stop the Aggression. And she created this in 1954 with the TGP to oppose the U.S.'s interference in Guatemalan politics in 1954. But then she reused this work 3 decades later in the mid-1980s by combining it with other works then about Chilean politics into a large print that she called Central America Says No. So she's now using her own sort of history of works as well as repetition and scale changes to really amplify a message that had become more mainstream at this point against imperialism and intervention. In 1971, the United States finally granted her a visa to come back to the United States, and that was to celebrate a show of her work that was going to be held at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And so this sort of began a sort of period where, even though she's still not a U.S. citizen, she does come back now and then. But she retired from active teaching. She had become, in fact, the first woman teacher or instructor of sculpture at UNAM, which is the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Was highly influential there as a professor and as chair of the department. So she retires from that teaching in 1975, but she continued to make artwork for decades to come, and increasingly focused her attention not just on sort of human scale works, but on large scale public commissions. And I'm showing you here her at work on a sculpture of Louis Armstrong for the city of New Orleans. So she is getting now commissions in the United States. Now, one of her public art commissions is this gorgeous wood sculpture called Floating Family. And it's a depiction of a mother and daughter clasping hands that was actually made for the Legler branch of the public library of the Chicago Public Library, just about a couple miles from here. And so it normally hangs over the circulation desk at the Legler. They took it down to lend it to this exhibition. And we have it hanging outside of the exhibition in our Griffin Court, sort of as a welcome beacon for the exhibition. And again, as a dedicated educator, this was very important for her to work on behalf of a library. She said at the time, "I was excited about the prospect of people sitting there, Black people sitting in that building reading." And she firmly believed that all people really did deserve to have access to art in their communities. And so public commissions such as this for the city of Chicago were really important for sort of enabling that ethos to come into fruition. And if you think about it, she's not creating a commission in the city of Chicago for downtown Chicago. She really is thinking about this branch, it's near Garfield Park, I want to say, of the library in a predominantly Black neighborhood far from the downtown. So she's thinking about that access. But indeed, throughout the rest of her career, and throughout really the last, I would say, 40 years of her career, she worked incidentally for 75 years of her life, she remained laser focused on the subject that had carried her for so long, which was, of course, women of color. And she really consistently used printmaking and sculpture to advocate for women, to advocate for mothers, and advocate for families. And so we actually, in the show, you'll see two final sort of sections of the exhibition that are somewhat interrelated. One is about motherhood and family. The other is about a section we call The Black Woman Speaks. Because they're so clearly all part and parcel of a long-term, multi-decade engagement with depicting Black women. And it certainly includes something like this incredibly tender mother and child that you see here in terracotta. And this is obviously a universal theme, but at this point, she had become a mother herself. This is 1956. So she's clearly drawing on her own experience as a mother to, convey sort of the deep love and protection that you see here. We see her taking on things like the age-old iconography of the Christian mother and child. This is a work she called Madonna. And yet this is a very modern Black woman. She's got, short natural hair, and she's curled her arm so protectively, again, in this print in front of the two children. But just because she could do protective and maybe a little bit sentimental did not mean that she always did. She could, in fact, be quite hard-hitting in her works as well. She was very aware that Black women and Indigenous women faced heightened challenges in raising healthy children. And so I'm showing you a poster on the left that she made with the TGP that's about increased mortality of children in mining villages in Mexico. And then on the right is a work that she called The Torture of Mothers, which is about gun violence in Black communities in the US. She actually based this work on a Life magazine cover from 1967 about a boy who was shot in police crossfire. And so she's represented that image as this prone boy sort of lying in this spilling array of red color, blood red color, superimposed against a larger head as if to sort of really indicate this is the mother, thinking and so concerned for her child. But above all, Catlett dedicated herself to celebrating Black women for all of their humanity and their individuality and their beauty. She said, quote, "I wanted to show the history and strength of all kinds of Black women, working women, country women, urban women, great women in the history of the United States." So we see many of her sculptures, again, taking on this idealized or timeless rendition of form that is quite lovely and beautiful. So this is a work called Stargazer from 1997. She is now into her later decades. And we see this woman reclining in a relaxed but very confident position. She's gazing up to the sky. It's very much a pose of aspiration and hope. And then there's this incredible lustrous marble. It's very smooth, it's very tactile. And so she's in full command of her skills at this point. She continued to make and carve her own sculptures until really the very end of her life. She continues with printmaking in innovative ways. This is a print called There's a Woman in Every Color, which is it's a complex print. It's both woodcut and linocut printing matrices coming together to create an image of a woman's face in both positive and negative space, while then you have this wonderful rainbow of figures along the edge to sort of reinforce this idea of a woman in every color, this sort of diversity of woman. But she didn't necessarily need the figure to be, in fact, a woman of historical importance, or even sort of a more generalized, timeless people. She also was just simply interested in depicting her family, her friends, her loved ones, to sort of really convey their personal characteristics and their individuality. And so we see that in these two works, one of which is called Terry on the left there, which is this lively, quick tempera painting. It's about 1954, so she continues to paint for years to come. And then Terry is sort of the surprise secret favorite of mine. Like I hadn't expected to fall in love with this work quite as much as I did. This is a monotype, which is a unique print. So essentially she would have taken a hard surface like glass, painted on it, and then pressed the paper onto it. When you lift it off, you lift off the pigment and you can never recreate the print. So it's a singular or unique print. This is just incredibly beautiful as a print. And I think, again, this is not a work that looks political. This is actually a portrait of her daughter-in-law, Teresa Mora. But it is part and parcel, again, of this idea that simply creating works of art that showcase the beauty and the humanity of Black women was a political stance. Now, in 1984, Catlett wrote, quote, "I am Black, a woman, a sculptor, and a printmaker. I am also married, the mother of 3 sons, and the grandmother of 5 little girls. I am a teacher and a student. I was born in the United States, and I am now a citizen of Mexico, having lived there since 1946. I believe that these states of being have influenced my work and made it what you see today." Indeed, these states of being were fundamental to every aspect of the development of Catlett's art, and it can really be seen in each and every work, from the most overtly political to the most tender depiction. But most importantly, Catlett was driven by her determination to say her piece through art. She knew that her works of art could have the power to inspire and influence, and she devoted her life to that cause in all of these different forms. And I'm showing you here a work that she called The Black Woman Speaks, which is such an apt symbol of her entire outlook and her entire career. It clearly represents her conviction that Black women have the right to self-expression, and she chose every day of her career to exercise that right in the form of her art. And so I hope very much that this lecture has given you a better understanding of the extraordinary life and art of Elizabeth Catlett, and I thank you again for joining me today. Thanks.
I saw this exhibition about a couple weeks ago, and it is fantastic. It is so well done, and I'm going to go back and see it again. So I encourage all of you to go see it before January 4th.
Thank you. I love the plug. Here's a question down here.
I'm interested in technique. I've seen the exhibit, and I was so blown away by the sculpture. How does one sculpt the material that she used to make those sculptures?
So that is a great question. The question is, how does she sculpt with all the different materials? And I'll actually start out by saying the thing that blows me away, just as a preamble, is that she used so many different materials. I mean, I showed you just some examples. She's working in wood. She's working in multiple kinds of wood. She works in terracotta. She works in marble. She works in onyx. So she's working in a great variety. The answer, honestly, is usually something like a little hand chisel. I mean, so at the very end of her life, her son, who was also a sculptor and a visual artist, helped her a little bit with some of the manual labor, but for most of her life, it's her chiseling away, smoothing over, I mean, so it is an incredible mastery of technique to sort of understand how the sort of actual block of marble or of wood or whatever is going to respond, very carefully, and thinking through sort of the entire sculpture in advance. But it's a lot, there's videos of her and she's just chiseling away at these things, even as an 80-year-old. It's impressive. So, yeah. Yes, here in the front, Jan.
I noticed she had really big hands. There was a couple of portraits, of her working with her hands, and I don't know if she really had big hands or if it was.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Did she have big hands or not? She certainly represented people with big hands a lot, so it very well could be that she had large hands. She was also pretty tall. I think that's what I'd noticed. I showed you that photograph of her at Howard University, and she's like 6 or 7 inches taller than most of. Yeah, so I've never seen her hands in a way that I could really understand that, but it's very possible because she did certainly, I think, like to foreground hands as the source of power and certainly the source of her power. So.
Why was she in Mexico and how long did she stay there?
Sure. Why was she in Mexico and how long did she stay? So she went to Mexico in 1946, and it really was that she had this fellowship, so she had money. She could support herself from the fellowship, and she didn't have to teach. So Mexico became a place she could go away from the teaching, away from sort of the responsibilities of everyday life. I should add, this is a moment where many American artists are going down to Mexico. They're drawn by figures like Diego Rivera, by Orozco, Tamayo. All of the sort of great muralists are in Mexico and very visible, often with shared politics. So there's a lot of interest by Mexican artists in going to Mexico. And she is certainly part and parcel of that. She does get married pretty soon thereafter, sort of a year after going to Mexico for the first time. And so that really is, I think, what keeps her in Mexico also long term, is having a life there, developing a life there. So she lives in Mexico from 1946, essentially until her death in 2012. But in the 80s, she bought an apartment in New York. So she was sort of back and forth a little bit more after the 1980s.
What was the reaction throughout her life of the Black community to her work, particularly as it evolved?
Mm-hmm. So the reaction of the Black community to her work, I would say it is not, so she's known in the 1940s. She's certainly exhibiting, as I said, sort of nationally. She exhibits at some exhibitions. So in the 40s, she's visible. And then I suspect she is not as visible, because her artworks are largely in Mexico. And I've heard sort of suggestions that once she was blacklisted, she would stuff her friends' cars with works of art to try to get them back into the US. But in 1967, I want to say, there's a really important profile of her in Ebony magazine, and that sort of catapults her into renewed visibility amongst Black art collectors and sort of Black communities more broadly. And then in 71, she has this retrospective at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and that sort of adds to it. So I would say, from the sense that I have is that she is much more known in Mexico between, say, 47 and 1967, and then 67 changes that. And then, this is a story that's very typical for Black artists, where they then were almost entirely known only within Black communities and not within the sort of broader mainstream or white art world in quite the same way. So,
you mentioned one of her sons. What are any of her sons or grandchildren in the arts?
Yes, actually, many of them. So the question is about her family. So she had 3 sons, and one of them became a visual artist. One of them is a filmmaker, and the third is a jazz musician. They're still alive. And then of her granddaughters, we actually just had one of them up for a program a couple weeks ago at the Art Institute. She is currently working on a documentary film about her grandmother, so she's moved in that direction. But oddly, or maybe not oddly, she was actually America's top model, and like won the entire competition one year and is a world famous model. So, I mean, she has a very remarkable family too, I would say. I mean, I think, if you're Elizabeth Catlett's child or grandchild, you are taught early on you will be exceptional, and they were, so, or they are still. So.
I looked her up, and it says that she lived to well into her 90s. Do you know what you could attribute her longevity to?
Oh, I mean, we should all be that lucky, I think. But, I don't know. I don't know why exactly you can say anyone lives, but she lived till she was 96. And maybe it was that she had incredible genes. Maybe that was she had incredible purpose in her life. But yes, she was... I mean, again, died when she was 96, had been making art for 75 years of that life. So it's a track record I think we would all like to have. Well, thank you all for joining.